Hello everyone, and welcome to the 9th in our series of Everyday Orientalism Talks. Our speaker today is Dr. Solange Ashby, who's going to be talking on the goddess Isis and the kingdom of Meroe, the enduring Nubian presence at Philae. Dr. Ashby received her PhD in Egyptology with a specialization in ancient Egyptian language and Nubian religion from the University of Chicago. She has researched in Egypt, the Temple of Philae, and participated in an archaeological excavation at El Kuru, Sudan, the Royal Kushite Cemetery. Her first book, Calling Out to Isis, The Enduring Nubian Presence at Philae, has just been published this year by Gorgias Press, and her current research explores the roles of women in traditional Nubian religious practices. Dr. Ashby is working on the first monograph in English dedicated to the history, religious symbolism, and political power of the queens of Kush. So a very warm welcome and thank you to our speaker today on behalf of me and my Everyday Orientalism co-organisers, Osama Ali Gad and Katrine Bluan. And we look forward to talk.
Thank you to Everyday Orientalism for inviting me to speak to you today about my research. I would like to dedicate today's lecture to Breonna Taylor. May she and her family find peace. This talk is a synopsis of the findings of my doctoral research in Nubian prayer inscriptions engraved into the stone walls of about 10 Egyptian temples located in Nubia. The inscriptions were engraved between the 1st and the 5th centuries of the Common Era, a time when Egypt was under Roman colonial rule. The figural graffito that you see on the left of your screen depicts the goddess Isis, the principal deity worshipped in this temple complex. Isis wears the horned solar disk of Hathor, with whom she became assimilated in this late period. Atop the solar disk sits the hieroglyphic symbol that writes the Egyptian name of the goddess, Aset. This graffito is one among many, textural and figural, that decorate the western exterior of the Gate of Hadrian at Philae. This area was a major focal point for Nubian prayer inscriptions during the 3rd century CE. The Temple of Philae sits on an island in the middle of the Nile River, and this temple was built during the Ptolemaic period, around 260 BCE. But it stands on the ruins of much earlier temples. Additionally, Philae continued to function long after other temples in Egypt had fallen into disuse because it was financially supported by Meroitic royal patronage. Temple cult was enhanced and supported by processions that arrived from Nubia well into the 5th century of the Common Era. In the image on the left, which I took from a boat approaching the island from the west side, you'll notice 2 monumental gates that stand before the temple, the first pylon and the second pylon. Between the 2 gates is the birth house, and behind the second pylon is the main temple dedicated to the goddess Isis. Jutting out from the west side of the main temple here is the Gate of Hadrian, which, as I just mentioned, was a major focus of Nubian cultic practice. In the image on the right, you can see the forecourt area before the first pylon. This area contains several small temples dedicated to Nubian gods, such as Ahrens-Nufis, Mondelez, and Thoth Panubs. The early Nubian inscriptions were found on structures here. The native Egyptian language, which is not Arabic, was written for an amazing 4,000 years. The earliest script shown on the upper left was the hieroglyphic script. This was developed as early as 3,200 BCE. This script was used for temple decoration and formal proclamations on stelae. Below it, we see the hieratic script, which represents the same symbols as hieroglyphic, but in a more cursive form, used by priests on documents written on papyrus. Demotic script, shown on the upper right, developed much later, in the 7th century BCE, as a business hand to record court judgments, marriage contracts, lease and loan documents. As native priests lost the ability to read and write hieroglyphs, Demotic became a script used to write sacred text, including the prayer inscriptions that I'll speak to you about today. Finally, Coptic was developed using the Greek alphabet to translate the Bible into the Egyptian language. The indigenous Egyptian scripts were too closely tied to native Egyptian religion and thus were not deemed appropriate for writing Christian texts. So in my dissertation research, I identified 3 discrete phases of Nubian epigraphic presence at the temples of Lower Nubia. In this talk, I'll focus specifically on the Temple of Philae. So these 3 phases were based on the admittedly rare dates included in the inscriptions, and also on the family relationships between those who dedicated inscriptions. On the bottom right, you can see the grand total of about 94 inscriptions can be securely designated as Nubian based on the following 3 criteria. First and foremost, on the non-Egyptian names used in these inscriptions, names like Raki, Abli, and Selwa, which Egyptologists will recognize as not Egyptian. Also included in these inscriptions are foreign titles in the Meroitic language, but transcribed often into Demotic, such as Shashameti, Keren, or Hebhan. And some inscriptions contain references to travel from Meroe. You'll note the predominance of Demotic as the language of choice in all 3 phases, and this indicates an assimilation of the Nubian priests and officials into the Egyptian temple hierarchy, as well as their respect for tradition. Yet the sizable number of Meroitic language inscriptions attest to the direct involvement of Meroitic royalty in the temple cult and administration, and the prestige awarded to the Meroitic language even after that kingdom fell around 330 CE. Only 2 Greek inscriptions occur in the 2nd phase of inscriptions, but by the 3rd phase, Greek inscriptions comprised almost 40% of the corpus. In that late phase, the kingdom of Meroe had fallen and Greek had become the language of communication between various groups of Nubians who spoke different languages, the Blemmyes and the Nubadae. Note also the dramatic increase in the number of Nubian inscriptions during phase 2. This is the period of Meroitic royal support for the Temple of Philae. Nubia is located in the Middle Nile Valley between the 1st and 4th cataracts. Philae Temple is located at the 1st cataract, and for non-Egyptologists, cataracts just mark places in the Nile River where granite boulder outcroppings make passage of ships or boats on the river difficult, and there are 6 cataracts noted from north to south. Okay, so Philae Temple is at the first cataract, which marks the traditional border between Egypt and Nubia. The sacred site of Jebel Barkal is at the fourth cataract. These two sites bracket the land of Nubia, Philae to the north and Jebel Barkal to the south. Merowe, capital of Kush, during the period of these Nubian inscriptions, is located just north of the sixth cataract. Okay, so these three discrete groups of Nubians. In phase one, inscriptions were made by local Nubians from the surrounding villages of this area called the Dodecaskoinos. So about 120 kilometer distance between Philae in the north and the other important temple of Dhaka in the south. These local Nubian villagers were compelled to deliver provisions to the temple of Philae. In the second phase of inscriptions, the powerful family of Waiakia priests and administrators came from an area just south of this southern border of the Dodecaskoinos, from area called Sayala, and their funerary monuments inscribed in the Meroitic language have been found in a village called Medik near Sayala. Phase three demonstrates a shift to the south for practitioners of traditional Nile Valley religion. And while we continue to have inscriptions in this last phase at Philae, it continues to be the central religious place of religious worship. We also have inscriptions further south. So at the site of Tafa, at Kalabsha, and then this center of Qasr Ibrim becomes increasingly important. And there's actually a really amazing temple of Isis discovered at the site of Qasr Ibrim. During this third and final phase of Nubian inscriptions, access to the divine statue of Isis from Philae remains central to the practice of those rites. Inscriptions tell us that the statue of the goddess was taken south annually to visit her shrines in Nubia. So during this earliest phase of Nubian inscriptions that I've called phase one, we can see that inscriptions were only engraved along the columns of the forecourt of the temple and two inscriptions in the doorway of that first pylon. This corpus of 7 inscriptions are not prayer inscriptions, they are agreements, almost like records of contractual obligation for different Nubian groups to arrive at the Temple of Philae to donate their offerings. And also these inscriptions give us information about how the offerings were then portioned out to different employees, if you will, at the temple. And so temple singers are mentioned, as well as the temple of Arns Nufus as recipients of these Nubian offerings. In this early phase, local Nubians then were functioning in an Egyptian-dominated context. They delivered their tithes to Philae as mandated during the preceding Ptolemaic period, in which 10% of the produce of Nubia was stipulated to be owed to the Temple of Isis at Philae, and such offerings as wine, wheat, wool, or gold are enumerated in the Nubian nome list at Philae. During this early period, Nubians focused their piety on Nubian gods, Arns Nufus and Thoth Panubs. And those who wrote these inscriptions were not temple priests, but rather cult association members. And it seems in this early phase that the Nubians who dedicated inscriptions here at Philae were not able to read or write Demotic. Here are some images of those Nubian gods that I referred to. On the left is Ahrinsnufis, and that hieroglyphic text that I've bracketed tells us that he comes from Ta Seti, an Egyptian designation for a Nubian region. On the right, we see Thoth Panubs, and the Egyptian text again tells us that he came from Ta Nehesi, probably further south in the region of Kerma, where Thoth Panubs was originally worshipped. The inset shows a copy of one of these early inscriptions in Demotic, read and written from right to left. It's Graffito Philae 24 that makes reference to the worshiper standing in the doorway of Ahrinsnufis. Moving on to phase 2 of the corpus. This is, as I mentioned, the largest corpus of inscriptions, about 57 inscriptions. You'll see that they have moved into the interior of the temple, so breached that first pylon. And I'd like to point out these 3 major areas that attracted Nubian inscriptions. So the Meroitic chamber, located here, the interior back wall of the second pylon that I'll refer to as the southwest corner of the pronaos, and then again the Gate of Hadrian, which I showed in that original photo. In this phase, Nubians claim the highest religious titles: Hemnetcher, priest, which can be translated as prophets, or Wab, priests. These titles indicate that they, at this phase, were trained to read and write the Egyptian sacred scripts of hieroglyphs and Demotic. They also claim, however, Meroitic priestly and administrative titles. And I've written those on the lower right of your screen. Karen of Isis, agent of Isis, the king's son of Cush, or the royal scribe of Cush. Some of the inscriptions also claim for the authors that they have knowledge of the movement of the stars, so astronomical knowledge. One priest, Waiakia A in Philae 421, says that he is a priest of the 5 living planets, those planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And this astronomical knowledge would have allowed these priests to determine when was the appropriate time to arrive at Philae to perform rites on behalf of the god Osiris. So these were very high-ranking priests and political emissaries who arrived at Philae with donations of gold sent from the king at Meroe, and they were honored. The Nubian priests were honored by their Egyptian colleagues, the priest resident at Philae. So I'll show you now an image from the walls decorating the Meroitic chamber. What we see here are 2 processions of Meroitic royal dignitaries accompanied by Meroitic text that describe the individuals and give us their names. So their names that we can read from these texts are Mashtarake, Bekamete, Apamalo, and Mani Tawawi. The last 3 of those also have inscribed their own text in the Demotic language. So there's a nice interplay between the Demotic inscriptions and the Meroitic language inscriptions. We also know from these Meroitic texts that they claim Meroitic administrative titles: Hebhan, Croro, Strategist of the water, Strategist of the land, Corin of Isis, agent of Isis. Only the last title that I just mentioned is known from the Demotic inscriptions. So this kind of cobbled together image in the center of the screen attempts to show the longest known Demotic inscription anywhere in Egypt, and it was inscribed for a Meroitic emissary from the king, from a royal emissary from Meroe. This, unsurprisingly, is inscribed on the exterior western face of the Gate of Hadrian, where it's one of many Nubian inscriptions, including figural graffiti, two of which have been identified by Eugene Cruz Uribe as Sasan, the author of this very long Demotic graffito. He's shown on the upper right of your screen, and King Tekora de Amani, the Meroitic king who dispatched Sasan to Philae. I'll read out just a couple of sections from this very long inscription, and the translation I'm using is Jeremy Pope's from his article in Encoria. So first quote, this is Sasan speaking. I came to Egypt that I might perform the rites that my Lord had ordered for me. I performed them. He had also ordered me to count the money, 10 talents, and to bring them to the temple compound of Isis for the Hemnecher priests, the Wab priest, and the daughters of the Wab priests. And so this is a clear indication of Meroitic funding for the temples of Philae and Dhaka during this period. Another quote. He ordered the king's son and the Karens of Isis to come to Egypt with me until we perform the festivals and banquets which are celebrated in the temple compound of Isis. We made our burnt offerings in return for the breath of life for the pharaoh, Tekora de Amani, my lord, end quote. And so this is a statement about the rites that these priests from Lower Nubia, so resident in this area of Sayala, just south of the Dodecaskoinos, were hired to perform on behalf of the Meroitic rulers much further south at the Sixth Cataract. During this phase, the second phase, Nubians are now acting at Philae in a Meroitic-controlled context as employees and ritual specialists on behalf of the king at Meroe. So these four scenes depict a milk libation rite, which is deemed anomalous in the Egyptian context. While such scenes appear frequently in the Egyptian temples of Nubia, we don't see them north of Philae ever. In such a milk libation rite, milk is poured over a table laden with offerings in order to purify them. So on the left, you see two images of two separate Meroitic kings who perform the rite at Dhaka on the top and Dabod, another temple in Lower Nubia. On the right, you can see the same type of scene as depicted at Philae, the top one in the pronaos, that is the backside of that second pylon. And the bottom one is depicted on the north wall at the interior of the Gate of Hadrian. Both the pronaos and this Gate of Hadrian, as I've mentioned, are two primary foci of Nubian piety during phase 2. So this rite was required to be performed for Osiris. It's part of the resurrection rites, if you will. And this image on the top right, I hope that you can see in front of the god Osiris here, one Nubian prayer inscription, and then before the goddess Isis, another longer Nubian prayer inscription. So these scenes of this anomalous milk libation rite were very attractive to the Nubians who arrived in the Egyptian temples of Lower Nubia and attracted a lot of those Nubian prayer inscriptions. What we see as we look further south is that this is a perfectly normal Nubian rite, the pouring of a milk libation. So from a door jamb at Sedinga, we see this in Meroitic Nubia, so in the provinces, if you will, from a Meroitic perspective, but also in the royal funerary chapels. In the city of Merowe, we see Anubis and Nephthys pouring milk libations over an offering table before the Meroitic king Amani-Ten Mamide in the 1st century CE. Also on multiple Meroitic offering tables, which I hope you can see around the outside, have inscriptions in the Meroitic language. And one of the prominent offering formulae included one for a milk offering, which I've written out here, which in Meroitic says something like, "May good milk be poured out for you." So we'll move on to the 3rd and final phase of Nubian inscriptions. In this phase, Greek becomes more prominent. As I've mentioned, Meroitic continues to be used, even though the kingdom of Meroe has fallen. And of course, Demotic is always the sacred language for worship at Philae. So I'd like to point out that the inscriptions have moved to the temple roof. So there are multiple inscriptions on the top of the temple of Isis, but also on the birth house. And it seems that the traditional priests have moved to the roofs to escape the Christian presence on the island. In fact, Christians and traditional priests shared this sacred space at Philae for about 100 years. The worshipers during this phase were Blemmyes, so people who moved into the Nile Valley from the eastern desert. And I'll show you an image on the next slide on the exterior wall of this structure. And I'd like to just point out that it is exactly behind the Meroitic chamber that was so important during phase 2. So you'll see here that we have many Greek inscriptions, but interspersed also with Demotic inscriptions here and here. There's also pharaonic royal imagery. So this crown on a hawk, which is the god Horus, closely associated with kingship in Egypt. And he's wearing the double crown that refers to Upper and Lower Egypt. So clear royal symbolism here. Also vulvae, and so that's making a reference to female sexuality, which was important through all of these 3 phases of Nubian worship. And then also this kind of strange hybrid deity. And I'm including here an image that I took so you can perhaps see it a little bit more closely. It is a hawk-headed deity wearing that horned solar disk that we saw on Isis at the very beginning of this talk, a crocodile body, and then a rearing cobra as a tail. And so it's quite possible that this is a female deity because she, I will say, is wearing the crown of Hathor that later was adopted for Isis. I'd like to also point out that there's this flowering lotus coming out of the back of this deity. And we see some very strange flower altars, I called them, which interestingly enough, also show up as graffiti in the funerary chapels in Merowe. So there's definitely a connection going on there. Just to show a couple images of the Beja people, who most scholars believe are direct descendants of the Blemmyes from that last phase of Nubian worship at Philae. Okay, and then finally, I'll just wrap up to say, so you can see that the 500 years of Nubian prayer inscriptions at Philae that I've just described for you are only part of this longer 1,000-year trajectory of Nubians at Philae. The Kushite king Taharqa left the oldest monument attested and still standing at Philae, a bark shrine inscribed with his name in royal cartouches. His monuments were dedicated to the god Amun, which shows that this site was, the earlier deity worship there was Amun and Hathor before the introduction of the goddess Isis. Meroitic rulers were active in temple building during the 3rd century BCE, when southern Egypt rebelled against foreign rule by the Macedonian Greek Ptolemies. And so we have temple building by the Meroitic king Arkamani II at Dhaka and Philae. And then his successor, Adi Kalamani, built at Dabod and also dedicated a stela at Philae. Later Meroitic rulers inscribed their royal names at that far southern temple that I mentioned. And these inscriptions date to the 1st century BCE. During a period when the Kandaka was battling Romans, trying to push south into Nubia. So we have Meroitic language inscriptions in the name of Queen Amanirenas, King Taritakas, and probably their heir, Akinidad. And finally, an inscription left by the penultimate Meroitic king, Yesbok-Heamani. And by now you will not be surprised to learn that his inscription is found at the Gate of Hadrian at Philae, paired Meroitic language inscriptions on the interior north and south wall. Since Nubians are the earliest attested worshippers at Philae, as well as the last to practice traditional religion at that temple, this site can rightly be considered a Nubian sacred space. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solange. Great talk, lots for us all to think about and discuss. We've got questions coming into the chat box already, which I'll just relay. The first couple are to do with iconography and some of the scenes that you showed us images of. Anne Austin asks if you could speak a little bit more about the flower altar graffiti and what your interpretations of them are. And then Laura Williams has a question about the procession of kings. What were all the figures holding, which were about their own height, but with varying numbers of triangles, decades, seasons, battles, she asks.
Okay, first of all, hi, Anne. Thank you for your question. So these flower altars, I'm not quite sure what to make of them. I think that they are akin to those offering tables that the milk libations were poured over in the 2nd phase of Nubian inscriptions. This, of course, is from the 3rd phase. I just find it really fascinating that very similar imagery shows up on royal monuments in the cemeteries at Meroe, but also on graffiti that's just been inscribed on those funerary chapels that jut out of the east side of the pyramid burials, royal burials in Meroe. It also shows up in so-called pot marks that are found throughout the Eastern Desert. So this is a whole dissertation waiting to be done, and something that I touch on briefly in my book, but I didn't really go very deep into fleshing out all of the connections, but certainly there is a cross-cultural powerful symbolism to these flower altars, because we see them at Meroe, we see them at Philae, we see them in rock outcropping shelters in the Eastern Desert. And so I'll just say that this has real potential for someone to do a dissertation on just the figural graffiti at Philae, because in my 3rd chapter of my book, I argue that that these figural graffiti are a way for worshipers who arrive at Philae and other sacred sites to leave their inscription, if you will, even if they are not able to write the sacred languages. And so figural graffiti abound at Philae and other temples. Rachel, maybe you could repeat the second question for me?
Sure. This was a question from Laura Williams, who says, in the procession of kings, what were all the figures holding about their own height, but with varying numbers of triangles? Decades, seasons, or battles? Question mark.
Good question. Yes. So this is from that Meroitic chamber again, and they are definitely holding palm staves. Each individual has a staff, and this is sort of a rough sketch of what a tall palm branch might look like. It's just potent symbolism in the Nubian culture and is closely tied to life because the palms grew by the water. So much of the food in Nubian culture comes from the various palms that grow along the Nile. We see this in the Meroitic funerary chapels, just row upon row of mourners who are depicted in procession, mourning the deceased king or queen. Each of them holds a palm staff. This continues to be important symbolism that I saw as recently as 4 years ago when I was last in Egypt, palm branches being laid upon graves in Nubia, both in Aswan and at El Kuru in Sudan. I witnessed this. And then finally, I know from reading John Kennedy's ethnographic work on Nubians that apparently traditionally Nubian women also labored to birth their children holding on to 2 palm branches. So this symbolism is deeply woven into the culture. In this particular instance, it's part of the ritual attire that indicates the rank and position of each of these very high-ranking Meroitic administrators who were often at the same time priests of various deities, Isis, but also Amun. And so I'll just point out also that in this phase 3 sort of larger than life graffito, that you can see that there are royal images of kings who are also holding what look to be palm staves, and this hybrid deity is also holding that same kind of palm staff. This gentleman is holding a wasp scepter, also a staff of authority. So there's a lot going on there, but it seems to be at its most basic tied to this understanding of the palm branch as a symbol of life.
Thank you. The next question is from Artie Mehta, who's just received your book on Isis and is excited to read it, who asks, what does Amani mean in Meroitic? If I can add another question to sort of piggyback onto that, I'm really interested in the multilingual nature of your research and the multilingual situation that you're drawing attention to here at Philae. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the challenges of working with material in Meroitic, which is only partially deciphered.
Thank you. Good question. Yes, I should have said that to start. Amani, as you're probably noting in the royal names that I mentioned, and also that Nubian who dedicated several inscriptions during phase 2, Mani Tawawi, refers, it's just the Meroitic name for Amun, who continues to be the central, most important god in the land of Kush. And so that includes Meroe. We see that with the Napatan kings, including the 25th dynasty Kushite kings in Egypt, that Amun is central. The most esteemed, highly regarded king of the gods, but also closely associated with royal iconography. So many of the Kushite rulers, as with the Egyptians, have the name Amun as part of their throne name. And so it appears as Amani or sometimes just Mani. Also good question, Rachel, about the multilingual, sorry, something is just popping in here. Let me see if I can, oh my, sorry. So the multilingual nature of Nubian worship is something that really drew me to this culture. Nubia, as I hope I showed on that map at the beginning, is a culture that is forever in between more powerful cultures to the north and south. So Egypt to the north and Meroe to the south. And so the Nubians traditionally never wrote their language, which is why we have such vague terms for the people resident there as A group, C group, the X group. But what they did do, and what I like to show in my study of their prayer inscriptions, is that they adopted and became proficient in the languages of whomever was controlling the temples where they were conducting their worship. And so as they sought to enter into the priesthood of temples in Lower Nubia, of course, they had to become proficient in the hieroglyphic and demotic scripts, and several of these men who wrote inscriptions in phase 2 like to flex, if you will, and so they include many lines or just a couple of words in hieroglyphs to show that they can write this most esteemed and quickly becoming forgotten script. But they also are using demotic. They, of course, since they are working for and paid by kings and queens in Meroe, they must also be proficient in the Meroitic language. And it's interesting that the power of Meroe during this mid-3rd century period, CE, is such that people who are arriving and worshiping are also choosing to leave their inscriptions in Meroitic. So they're still understanding that Demotic is the sacred language in these Egyptian temples, but as the funders of these Egyptian temples, they are also feeling fully justified in writing their inscriptions in Meroitic. And then finally, Greek really comes to the fore when these groups that are moving into Lower Nubia, the Blemmyes and the Nubadae, they're speaking very different languages. There's a very complex language situation going on, and none of these people had adopted writing. And so they turned to Greek as the lingua franca, if you will, in order to be able to conduct negotiations, political negotiations with each other in writing. And so there's a whole corpus of fascinating letters between Blemmy kings and Nubadae kings that were preserved and later excavated at Qasr Ibrim. And so because it's such a rich border area, we have all of these languages coming together, we have all of these different ethnic groups coming together, and we have all of these different religious practices coming together. And for me, that's just so juicy. It's where I want to be doing my research to understand how all of these different facets influenced each other.
Fabulous. Next question is from Catherine, who asks if you can tell us a bit more about the 100-year period during which Christian and traditional priests shared the temple at Philae, This is, yeah, I want to know more about this as well. What it makes me think of is, you know, the situation in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where the Coptic Orthodox and the Ethiopian Orthodox are disputing possession of the roof at the minute. What's going on with the sharing of the temple space at Philae?
Yes, so it's also combative. I believe there's a Paschal letter from about 320 CE that mentions a bishop at Philae. So this is a first clear indication that there's an established Christian community at Philae. Anyone who's visited the temple will note the Orthodox crosses engraved into, for example, the door jamb as you're passing through the second pylon, but crosses are all over the temple complex. An altar was set up in that pronaos where the Nubians of phase 2 were leaving so many of their inscriptions. Those Nubian inscriptions were in the southwest corner, while the Christian, now later Christian altar was set up on the eastern side of the pronaos, as we would expect for a Christian church. And so they certainly were there at the same time, and there was conflict. And so there is a late Nubian inscription from phase 3 that talks about a devastating order or something of to that effect, probably referring to the edict of the patriarch in Alexandria ordering that all traditional Egyptian temples should be closed. Similarly, there's a Greek inscription, I believe also in that doorway of the second pylon, may be wrong on that, that says the cross has triumphed, the cross always triumphs. So the exultant Christians crowing about their victory over the native practitioners of Egyptian and Nubian religion. There's also a Greek text that talks about, I believe it is the first bishop at Philae, who was the son of a high priest at the temple of Philae, who by trickery has a look at the sacred falcon, which used to be housed between the two piers, if you will, of the first pylon. He asked to have a look at the sacred falcon and make an offering to him, and instead chops off the head of this falcon. And so there are all these indications that it was not a friendly coexistence. And for me, that speaks to why these phase 3 inscriptions now move to the roof of the main temple and the birth house to try to escape these aggressive Christians, who would, of course, have been local Egyptians who converted to Christianity, but in their zeal were eager to expel traditional priests who would have been functioning in the temple at the same time. I guess the last thing I want to say is I found it super interesting that there are 2 or 3 Christian inscriptions, graffiti, that written in Greek, in which the author identifies himself as Nubade. So he says, I so-and-so Nuba, and then a Christian cross. But these inscriptions are on that same area in the southwest of the pronaos that was such an important draw for Nubians in phase 3, when they were, phase 2, I'm sorry, when they were still traditional practitioners.
Thanks. Well, that leads us in quite nicely to our next question, which stays with this theme of ethnic identity and belonging coming forward into the present day as well, which is from Osama Gad, who asks if you could elaborate more about the Beja people and the linguistic, cultural, and ethnic discontinuity of the Nubian people in this region or beyond. And a related question, Are you able to comment on the uses and misuses of Nubian identity in the modern context of this part of Egypt? In other words, are you aware of any modern users of this Nubian history in supporting the modern cause of the Nubians around this area?
I feel like I'm more comfortable answering the first question, so I'll start with that. The Beja people were resident in the Eastern Desert. They're referred to as Blemmies in this period, 4th, 5th century CE. They became kind of fearsome warriors when the use of the camel was introduced. And so they're known from Greek sources for these lightning strikes into the heart of Egypt, even I think as far north as Thebes. Eugene Cruz-Uribe, who, rest in peace, who was an advisor on my dissertation, has suggested that they were coming in the defense of traditional sites of traditional worship that were being taken over by Christians. And so these attacks, seen as political attacks by the Roman authorities in Egypt, perhaps may have been the Beja people, Blemmy people, attempting to defend these traditional sacred sites. So the Blemmy people speak Cushitic language, so it's part of the larger Afro-Asiatic language family that includes the Egyptian language, and the only parts of this language family not resident on the African continent are the Semitic languages, so Akkadian, Hebrew, Arabic, those languages. And so these Beja people were arriving into the Nile Valley. I think 394 is sort of a date of them sort of filtering into the Nile Valley from the east and establishing themselves, perhaps most importantly, at the Temple of Kalabsha, where their traditional god Mandair, who we know his name is Mondelez through the Greek, and they are the people who are sending priests or hiring and paying Egyptian priests to conduct rites on their behalf at the Temple of Philae. I hope that answered the question. And then I'm a bit confused about sort of the misuse of Nubian cultural patrimony in the modern period. Rachel, am I understanding that question correctly?
I think what Osama, maybe he can correct me if I'm wrong, is asking about is the extent to which people have mobilized a sense of Nubian history and heritage to support political and social issues regarding the Nubian community and their displacement and so forth in the present day.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that clarification. Yes, it has become a really important rallying point for the Nubian people, as we all know, who have been dispossessed by the flooding, drowning, if you will, of their traditional lands along the Nile. And so this history, the language, the Nubian languages, which are dying out, but people are working to try to reclaim, and the symbolism have all become important rallying cries for Nubians in Egypt as well as in Sudan. So you may remember that sort of viral photo from last year, April 2019, of Alaa Saleh, who was a 22-year-old university student in Khartoum, who dressed up to evoke Nubian womanhood and came to be called the Kandaka, a royal title used for these powerful Meroitic queens. And this, her claiming of this traditional female power to topple The dictator al-Bashir in Sudan was very powerful, but perhaps that's just maybe the best known example. It's heartening to me to see the Nubian community going back to learn their history and culture, people working to preserve the language. So I'll give a shout out to Dima Mahmood, who just recently hosted the very successful Nubia Fest 2020 online that just sought to bring together scholars, interested Nubian people to talk about the history, culture, and also to bring attention to the fact that these people are, I would say, oppressed minorities in both of their countries, Egypt and Sudan, and to bring attention to those communities. And really importantly, to try to save the numerous Nubian languages that are really endangered right now, both along the Nile, in the Kordofan Mountains, and in Darfur.
Thanks. I think it's interesting to focus on this because so much attention in the West, in Europe and America, has been on the destruction of monuments, the moving of monuments with the Aswan Dam activities, and there's been less attention given to the severing of the relationship of a people with their land and their cultural heritage and their places that are important to them and so forth. So it's really nice to see that being rectified in however small a way at present. Perhaps a couple more final questions before we let you have a well-deserved rest. Brian Smith asks, how much of the material culture, ceramics, etc., I think he must mean at Philae here, reflect Nubian identity versus Egyptian/Greco-Roman images? That might be a tough question to answer.
Rachel, I will ask you to repeat it because you kind of faded out there for a minute. And so you said the question's from Brian Smith?
Yes, sorry about that. I'll repeat
Hi, Brian.
it. How much of the material culture, ceramics, votive figures, etc., reflect Nubian identity versus Egyptian/Greco-Roman images?
So I am less aware of pottery or objects found in the vicinity of Philae. My focus was really on the textual attestation of Nubian presence at Philae and Dhaka. It's interesting as you move further south, there are amazing examples of Nubian pottery, Meroitic pottery specifically, from sites like Karanog, Qasr Ibrim. So museums like the Penn Museum in Philadelphia or the Oriental Institute at University of Chicago have amazing collections of these this pottery, which is some of the most beautiful pottery from the ancient world. There are also, for example, this is a bit further south, but the Meroitic offering tables are also full of information about the religious practices of the people at this period, and they're often inscribed with texts, which, although Meroitic is, we know how to sound out the letters and we understand some of the words, like those titles that I was telling you about, or some kinship terms, it still is really difficult to translate larger texts. And so, but the formulaic inscriptions from these funerary monuments are better understood. I hope I've answered your question, Brian. For example, the inscriptions make it clear that there were divine statues, obviously, at the Temple of Philae, and the Nubians claim, truthfully, of course, that they came annually with gold to give sort of as outright donations, but they also brought goldsmiths with them. And this is one of my favorite parts of this phase 2 corpus. And so they describe in their inscriptions about how they gild, they make new. And so we can understand that they're gilding every year that they come these divine statues of Isis and Osiris. And I propose in my book, in that chapter 2 on phase 2, that in fact one of those gilded statues of Osiris stood in this southwest corner of the Pronaos. And so that was an additional reason why these inscriptions were clustered in this area of the temple. And then if you'll indulge me, because I'm all about the Meroitic gold, we also know that almost every single inscription in which the author claims the title goldsmith is found in the interior stairs of the second pylon. And so I have suggested, based off of the work of a woman whose first name I can't remember, last name is Martzloff. She was writing about the interior of the pylons being used as temple treasuries. She wrote more about the first pylon, but I believe these inscriptions inside of the second pylon at Philae indicate that all of that gold that was being brought from Meroe was stored in there, but also perhaps worked into cultic objects, because that very long inscription, Philae 416, talks about all of the various cultic objects, Hess vessels and situli and other objects being made from the raw gold that was brought from Meroe.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up with something lovely and shiny to think about. Thank you so much, Dr. Solange Ashby. You've given us a really more intimate understanding of how people actually use and related to the site at Philae, as well as a broad swathe of an idea of how practices and different communities operated at the site over time. A reminder that you can find further reading about this talk on the Everyday Orientalism blog, and you can also link through to Solange's book there if you're interested in finding more about Meroe and Philae and the rest of her research. So thank you very much. If people would like to turn on cameras and microphones and give Dr. Ashby a well-deserved round of applause, and thank her once again for a great talk.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again at the next talk.